Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes. Feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins.
The Curse of the Ancient Barrows, an epic tale in the ancient style. Section 1. Shadowed Beginnings, The Stirring Dark. In the third age of Middle-earth, when shadows began to lengthen across the lands, whispers arose from the ancient downs between the Old Forest and the Great East Road. The Barrow-Downs, where kings of old lay in stone circles beneath green hills, stirred with evil that had not walked beneath stars since the Witch-king's dominion. Gandalf the Grey rode slowly along the weathered path, his staff tapping worn stones. The wind carried strange voices, half-heard melodies of sorrow and binding. His grey eyes gazed upon rolling mounds where pale lights flickered in gathering dusk. "Long have these hills slept," he murmured to Shadowfax, whose ears lay flat. "Yet sleep brings dreams, and not all dreams that come to the dead are peaceful." The wizard had come at Tom Bombadil's bidding, that strange fellow who alone seemed master of wild lands between Bree and Rivendell. Old Tom had spoken in riddles. "The Barrow-wights stir, my good Gandalf. Old bones remember old grudges, and shadows walk that should lie still." As twilight deepened, Gandalf saw them, pale flames dancing atop burial mounds, cold fires giving no warmth. They moved with purpose, circling ancient barrows in patterns of ritual and summoning. The very air grew thick with malice, as if earth itself remembered pain. From the largest mound, crowned with standing stones black against stars, came hollow singing in the black speech of Mordor, speaking of binding and eternal service. Gandalf dismounted, placing his hand on Shadowfax's neck. "Wait here, my friend. What lies ahead is not for the living to face, save those who must." Section 2. A Whisper in the Trees, the Old Forest Remembers. The night wind carried Gandalf's words southward, where the old forest pressed close against the downs. In the deepest wood, where Withywindle ran dark beneath hanging willows, Old Man Willow felt the disturbance like pain in his heart would. The trees remembered everything, every battle on their borders, every king laid to rest, every shadow that crept across their realm. They had watched the barrows building when the world was greener, when kings ran strong and the Dunedain held the north against darkness. Old Man Willow stretched roots deep, feeling through the network connecting all growing things. Beneath burial mounds he sensed movement that should not be, the dead walking with purposeful stride, not peaceful tread of spirits at rest. "Tom," whispered the great willow, voice rustling through every leaf. "Tom Bombadil, the wights walk again, and this time they do not sleep when dawn comes." In his house by Withywindle, Tom started from his chair, his round face growing grave as he listened to the tree's voice. "Hey, Doll, merry Doll," he said quietly without his usual joy. "Old troubles come again, do they?" Goldberry looked up from her weaving, troubled. "The river speaks of cold things stirring, Tom. Fish swim deeper, and waterbirds have fled to distant streams." Tom rose and peered toward the downs, seeing pale lights burning brighter than before, their patterns speaking of purpose and dark intent. "The Witch-king's shadow grows long again," he murmured. "Though his body was broken, his malice lives on in places he marked with power." Section 3. The Lone Rider, Gandalf's Solitary Journey. The wizard stood alone before the great barrow as stars wheeled overhead. From within came sounds no living ear should hear, bone scraping stone, grave clothes stirring, and beneath all low chanting in black speech that made the air tremble with malice. "Come then, grey fool," called a voice from within. "Enter our halls and learn what we have learned in long darkness. The songs of the Eldar grow faint, and light of Valinor is but memory. Only shadow endures." Gandalf stepped forward, staff blazing with white fire that drove shadows back. "I have walked in darkness before," he said, voice echoing strangely. "I have seen the foundations of the world and roots of the sky. Your shadows hold no terror for me." The passage sloped downward, lit by phosphorescent growths giving no warmth. Walls lined with alcoves where lesser dead rested, bones arranged in patterns of ritual binding. Each skeleton wore a circlet of gold, but the metal was black with tarnish. At the heart lay the burial chamber of the greatest king, carved from living rock, Upon a throne of black marble sat a figure that had once been a man, the Barrow-wight king in robes of dried blood, crown upon a skull whose sockets burned with cold fire. "Behold the last king of Cardolan," said the wight, rising with rustle of ancient fabric. Much good it did him, or his people, or his proud realm. All are dust now, all serve the darkness that cannot die. Gandalf raised his staff higher, its light revealing the chamber's full horror. Carved scenes of victory defaced with leering skulls, star maps turned to shadow and despair. Section 4. Dol Guldur in the distance. The source of shadow, far to the east, beyond misty mountains and dark Mirkwood, stood a tower upon a hill that had once been fair. Dol Guldur reared broken walls against the sky like bones of some great dead beast. Though the necromancer had been driven forth, his influence lingered, seeping through stone like poison. In deepest vaults, where no light had ever shone, shadows moved with purpose. A figure stood in ruins of the throne room, more shadow than substance, more memory than flesh, but its will was iron. This was a lieutenant left to tend smouldering embers of evil. The shadow raised arms and spoke black speech that made Dol Guldur's stones tremble. The spell reached out like grasping fingers to touch burial mounds where kings lay restless. "Awake," whispered the shadow, voice carrying on spirit winds. "Awake, servants bound by oath and torment. The time of hiding is past. Let the dead walk, and let the living tremble." In the Barrow-Downs, the White King felt the call like fire in his bones. The chain about his neck grew hot, stone pendant pulsing with dark light. Around him, lesser wights stirred to greater wakefulness, hollow eyes kindling with purpose not their own. The shadow did more than wake the dead. It drew forth darkness planted long ago, the Witch-king's final curse that would turn their virtues into weapons against the living. "Yes," hissed the White King, voice carrying new strength, "let them remember what they have forgotten. Let them pay the price for peace bought with our blood." Section 5. Into the black entry into the ruins, Gandalf descended deeper, his staff carving white paths through pressing darkness. The air grew heavy with years and breath of unquiet dead. Ancient tapestries hung in tatters, once bright threads faded to bone colour, depicting victories made meaningless by ultimate defeat. Chanting grew louder, multiple voices in harmonies never meant for living throats. Black speech echoed from carved stone, each syllable a violence against world's peace. Gandalf felt its weight pressing against his spirit, seeking cracks where doubt might take root. "You feel it, don't you, Mithrandir?" The White King's voice came from everywhere. The futility of hope, certainty of ending. We held passes for 40 years, and what did it avail? Our realm fell, our people scattered, our bones pressed into enemy service. The burial chamber opened like a wound in earth, walls carved with genealogies of the lost kingdom. Behind the throne stood a presence casting no shadow, yet darkening the air, tall, thin, wrapped in robes of darkness itself. "A lieutenant of the shadow," Gandalf said steadily. "You have come far from your master's tower. These downs are not within your dominion." The shadow thing spoke like whisper of dead leaves. "All places where despair has taken root belong to us. All hearts that have known defeat, all spirits that have tasted corruption, these are ours by right." The White King rose, burial sword gleaming with dark fire. Around the chamber, other wights emerged, warriors and servants, all who had died in the kingdom's final wars, their faces hidden behind tarnished burial masks. "Behold the army of the forgotten," the shadow whispered, "those who died for causes that failed. They have learned the truth. All struggles end in darkness. All hopes crumble to dust." Section 6. The Captive King. A prisoner reveals truth. As Gandalf's words echoed through the burial chamber, something changed in the White King's bearing. The cold fire flickered, and for a moment something else looked out. Pain, but not twisted corruption. Clean, honest pain of one who had loved much and lost all. "The true song," the White King whispered, voice carrying a note unheard for centuries. "I remember music once, in Fonost's halls. Harpers played, children's voices rang in courtyards. My daughter, little Morwen, she sang like a lark at dawn." The shadow thing turned with alarm. "Silence, slave. Remember your bonds, your torment, the truth of ending, but the White King raised one skeletal hand, dark fire dimming. Truth, he said, now speaking as the man he had been, Argaleb the Last. What truth is there in service to a lie? I was Argaleb, son of Arafor, heir to Isildur's line. I held northern passes 40 years. I died with sword in hand and my people's name upon my lips. The shadow hissed, raising void arms. You died a failure. Your kingdom fell, your people scattered. Your daughter died in Fornost's ruins, calling for a father who could not save her. The words struck like physical blows, but Gandalf stepped forward, staff blazing. Yes, he said gently but unwavering. You failed, Argaleb of Cardolan. Your kingdom fell, your people scattered, your daughter died. These things are terrible and true, but they are not the only truth. Argaleb looked up with eyes no longer empty, but deep wells of ancient sorrow. What other truth can there be? I have had centuries to contemplate failures, count the cost of inadequacy. The truth of what you chose, Gandalf replied. You could have fled when armies darkened the horizon, but you chose to stand, to fight, to die rather than surrender those you had sworn to protect. Around the chamber, other wights stirred, some straightening as if remembering something forgotten. The crushing weight of despair began to lift, letting silver threads of original blessing shine brighter in carved stone. Section 7. The Necromancer's Voice. A shadow speaks. The shadow thing reared back as Gandalf's light blazed, but instead of fleeing, it drew upon deeper power, growing more solid and terrible. When it spoke again, its voice was no longer dead leaves, but something far more dreadful. The necromancer himself, carried from Dol Guldur on winds of malice. So, Mithrandir, came the voice that had once ruled from the Hill of Sorcery. You think to undo in one night what was woven over centuries. You think your little light can cleanse what bears Mordor's seal. The air thickened, pressing upon assembled spirits with absolute despair. Even Argaleb, beginning to remember his true purpose, swayed beneath that terrible voice's assault. I know you, grey fool, the necromancer continued. I have watched you for centuries, always arriving too late to prevent the tragedies you claim to fight. How many realms have fallen while you wandered? How many noble hearts broken while you pondered? Gandalf stood firm, but Argaleb could see the toll, the wizard's face drawn with effort, something in his eyes speaking of old sorrows, failures that cut deep. Yes, hissed the necromancer, sensing weakness. You remember, Erebor's fall when Smaug came and you were far. Away! Dale's destruction when men you might have warned died screaming in dragonfire. How many times have you arrived to find only ashes? The White King watched Gandalf's light flicker and saw something he recognized. The crushing weight of responsibility, the terrible knowledge that no matter how hard one fought, it was never enough to save everyone who deserved saving. But Argaleb, looking at the wizard's face, saw something else. Not just pain of failure, but the choice to continue despite that pain. Here was one who had walked in shadow yet still carried light, who had seen kingdoms fall yet still fought for the next that might stand. You speak of failure, Shadow, Argaleb said, rising with dignity that made burial robes seem like royal regalia. But I see one who has never stopped trying, never ceased to hope. That is victory you cannot understand. Section 8. Fire in the Darkness. Gandalf defies the dark. In sudden silence following the shadow's departure, Gandalf stood in the burial chamber's centre, staff blazing with white fire. The light seemed different now, not just fierce radiance of power unleashed, but something warmer, more hopeful, touched with golden glow of dawn breaking over distant hills. Around him, Cardolan's noble dead stood as if waking from long, terrible dream. Cold fire had gone from their eyes, replaced by gentle gleam speaking of peace finally found. Argaleb looked at his hands, skeletal still but no longer hideous. Dark fire wreathing his burial sword was gone, leaving blade gleaming with clean light. His crown began to shine with gold of its making, as if metal remembered what it had been forged to represent. How long, he asked, voice barely above whisper. How long have we served Shadow, thinking it was justice? By the living world's reckoning, near 1,000 years since the Witch-king first marked these downs with malice, Gandalf replied gently. 1,000 years of torment, of being turned against everything you fought to protect. One by one, Other wights began to speak, voices blending in chorus of recognition and regret. They remembered now, not just deaths, but lives, causes served, people loved, small daily acts of kindness and courage. "What would you have of us, Mithrandir?" Argleb asked, approaching with dignity he had possessed in life. "We have been cleansed, freed from Shadow's lies, but we are still dead, still spirits bound to bone and barrow mound." "That choice is yours," Gandalf replied. "You can pass on to whatever reward awaits the faithful dead, or you can remain, not as servants of Shadow but as guardians of light. The Barrow-Downs could be something else, a place where noble dead watch over roads and keep safe passage for those travelling in peace." Argleb considered this, looking around at his followers. In their faces he saw the same longing, not for revenge or power, but for purpose, for making their long suffering mean something more than simple endurance. "Then let it be so," Gandalf said, raising his staff high. "Let the Barrow-Downs be a place of watching and ward. Let green hills remember not just sorrow and defeat, but courage and sacrifice and love that binds all people of goodwill." Section 9. Return to the wise report to the White Council. Dawn broke over the Barrow-Downs as Gandalf emerged from the Great Mound, Shadowfax waiting patiently. The pale lights that had danced atop burial hills were gone, replaced by gentle golden glow emanating from Earth itself, as if the Downs remembered the sun. 3 days later, Gandalf stood in Rivendell's great council chamber, facing his peers. Elrond sat at the curved table's head, ageless face grave. To his right sat Galadriel, eyes holding depths reflecting the two trees' light. Opposite, Saruman maintained scholarly detachment, though Gandalf sensed new tension. "The Barrow-Downs are cleansed," Gandalf reported. "The Wights now serve as guardians of ancient roads. But the shadow that held them came from Dol Guldur, sent by one still serving the necromancer's will." Elrond leaned forward, dark eyes troubled. "We drove the necromancer from his stronghold 20 years past. How can his influence reach so far?" "Evil is not easily undone," Galadriel said, voice like silver bells. "What was wrought in malice over long years cannot be cleansed by single victory. The shadow we faced was but the hand. The mind that guided it has retreated but not been destroyed." Saruman spoke carefully. The necromancer was revealed as one of the Nazgul, a powerful servant, but not the enemy himself. With Dol Guldur broken, what threat remains? Gandalf studied his fellow wizard's face, noting how Saruman's eyes didn't quite meet his own. "The threat lies not in what we have faced, but what we have yet to confront." The Shadow Thing spoke with a voice I recognized, one who commanded the Nine, not served among them. The necromancer was no mere ringwraith, he was their master. Silence fell, heavy with implication. Even Galadriel's composure seemed shaken. But Saruman spoke first, voice sharp with anger or fear. "Impossible. The Dark Lord fell with the ring's cutting. His form was destroyed, power broken. What you suggest would mean—" "That he has returned," Gandalf finished quietly. "Not in full strength, not yet, but returned nonetheless. The shadow we drove from Dol Guldur was Sauron himself." The council chamber fell silent again, each member lost in thoughts and fears. Through windows, Rivendell's peaceful valley stretched toward mountains, but now it seemed fragile, precious. A small island of tranquility in a world sliding toward war. Section 10. Stirring the North Gandalf begins quiet plans. From Rivendell, Gandalf rode northward into wild lands beyond the Misty Mountains, following paths few knew and fewer dared travel. His destination was the Lonely Mountain, where beneath, stone and dragon flame lay treasures more than gold, the memory of what dwarves had been and could be again. As he rode, the wizard's mind turned over the problem like a chess player studying a board. The Free Peoples were divided, weakened by centuries of peace that had made them forget freedom's cost. Gondor stood proud but diminished. Rohan was strong but distant. The elves were withdrawing, taking wisdom and power with them, but the dwarves— there was a people that remembered loss, carried grief and anger like weapons waiting to be drawn. Driven from their greatest halls, scattered like seeds on wind but unbroken, they endured, planned, dreamed of reclaiming what was theirs by right. 3 days later, In a hidden valley between peaks known only to stone shapers, Gandalf sat before a council fire with 5 dwarf lords whose beards were white with age and eyes burned with memory of ancient wrongs. They were the last of great houses, survivors of Erebor's fall. "Smaug stirs in his lair," reported Balin, son of Fundin. "Our scouts report lights in lower halls, great wings beating in darkness. He has slept 60 years, but now something calls from the east." "The same thing that calls to all servants of shadow," Gandalf replied. "Sauron has returned, though he hides behind masks. The great war we feared is beginning, and we must choose whether to face it united or alone." "United? With whom?" Dwalin spat into the fire. "The men who fled at first flame, the elves who shut their doors, the Bornings who care only for their borders?" "With whoever will stand when the test comes," Gandalf answered, "but first with each other. The dwarves have been scattered too long. The 7 houses must be one house again, as in Durin's days." "Easy words," said Oin, stroking his white beard. "The houses have old quarrels. How can broken things be mended when pieces lie scattered across half the world?" "One piece at a time," Gandalf replied. "But it must begin with you, the heirs of Erebor, holders of the oldest grudge and greatest cause." He leaned forward, eyes reflecting firelight. "I have heard there is one among you who carries Durin's blood and burning desire to see his people's wrongs made right. Thrain's son, they call him. In others, they whisper he is already king in exile." The lords exchanged glances. Finally Balin spoke carefully. "There is such a one. Thorin Oakenshield speaks often of reclaiming Erebor, of gathering an army to assault the Lonely Mountain." "And what if the cause were not hopeless?" Gandalf smiled. "What if there were a way to enter Erebor unseen, to strike before the dragon could bring full power to bear? Tell me, what do you know of hobbits?" Section 11. A Hobbit Remembered Introducing the Shire and Bilbo. Far to the west, beyond mountains and Mirkwood's dark eaves, lay a land seeming to exist outside history's great currents. The Shire was green and pleasant, dotted with round doors and smoking chimneys where pressing concerns were crop states and ale quality at village inns. In Hobbiton village, neither largest nor smallest but generally agreed most respectable, lived a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. He was exactly the sort other hobbits approved of, well-to-do but not ostentatious, curious about neighbours' affairs but not given to gossip, possessed of a larder that was the district's envy. On this particular morning, Bilbo was deciding whether his garden gate needed repainting. It was a question occupying his mind for a week, and he was no closer to resolution. The gate was green, as long as anyone remembered, but paint had begun to fade and chip. A proper hobbit would repaint immediately, but Bilbo found himself oddly reluctant. "Peculiar," he muttered, adjusting his waistcoat. "Most peculiar indeed." What Bilbo didn't know was that his peculiarity made him interesting to certain wizards concerned with Middle-earth's fate. While neighbours saw only a respectable hobbit with unfortunate eccentricity, Gandalf remembered a different Bilbo, a young hobbit who had lingered at this gate, listening with fascination to tales of distant lands and ancient wonders. That had been many years ago. Time moved strangely for wizards, and Gandalf's last Shire visit seemed like yesterday, though decades had passed by mortals' reckoning. Bilbo would be older now, more settled, perhaps less inclined to wander about the world beyond his comfortable burrow. But the spark that had caught Gandalf's attention would still be there. As if summoned by distant thoughts, Bilbo found himself remembering that long-ago encounter. He had been barely more than a faunt when the tall grey figure appeared at the lane's end like something from the old stories. They had talked for hours about dragons and elves, about the wide world beyond the Shire's borders, about adventures and strange folk who went looking for them. "Adventures," Bilbo said aloud, startling a robin. What did he say about adventures? Something about nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things that made you late for dinner. But even repeating the old joke, Bilbo felt a stirring in his chest, a sense that the world was larger than Hobbiton, more interesting than the endless round of meals and market days. He looked up at the clear blue sky above green hills and wondered what lay beyond the horizon. It was a song about leaving, about travelling, about the wide world and its wonders, not the sort respectable hobbits usually hummed. But then, as Bilbo was beginning to suspect, he might not be quite as respectable as his neighbours believed. Bilbo Baggins didn't know it yet, but his quiet life was about to become very interesting indeed. Somewhere in northern wastes, a wizard was making plans that would lead him back to a round green door and a hobbit who had once listened to adventure tales with stars in his eyes. Soon, it would have need of a burglar. Section 12. The Plan Set. In motion dwarves, maps, and prophecy. In the hidden valley where dwarf lords had gathered, Gandalf spread upon the ground something that made their eyes widen with wonder. It was a map drawn on ancient parchment, with inks gleaming silver in firelight. The sight stirred memories deeper than conscious thought. "Behold," said Gandalf, "the map of Thror the King, drawn by his own hand when Erebor stood proud. See here, the secret door, hidden on western slopes where the thrush knocks and setting sun casts shadows in a key's shape." Balin leaned forward, weathered face transformed. "The map of the king," he whispered. "We thought it lost when Smaug came, burned in dragonfire with so much else precious and irreplaceable." "Not lost, but hidden," Gandalf replied. "Thrain bore it when he fled Erebor, kept it safe through years of exile. When madness took him and he disappeared into wild lands, he passed it to one who could be trusted." Dwalin's scarred hand traced the mountain's outline. A secret door. But what good is a door without a key? And how would we pass the dragon? Smaug sleeps lightly and his fire burns hotter than ancient forges. "As for the key," Gandalf said, producing a small wrapped object, "that too was preserved." He unwrapped it, revealing a key of curious design, long-shafted and many-toothed, made of silver holding light within its metal. The dwarf lords stared as if it were a fallen star. In their minds they could see the door it would open, could imagine walking once more in halls their fathers had carved from living stone. "You speak of passing the dragon as simple matter," said Oin slowly, "but Smaug is not some common worm to be outwitted by tricks. He is cunning beyond measure, cruel beyond description, his hide harder than finest mail." Gandalf's eyes twinkled in firelight. "Who spoke of force? Dragons are mighty but also proud, and pride can be weakness as well as strength. Smaug has grown comfortable, secure, convinced none would dare challenge him. He expects armies, and armies he is prepared to meet with fire and claw." "What then?" Balin asked. "A burglar," Gandalf said simply. "One small person, moving quietly, taking nothing more than he can carry. Smaug counts his hoard coin by coin, but even dragons cannot watch everything at once. A skilled thief might enter and leave without the great worm knowing." The dwarf lords exchanged glances. It was mad, certainly, but also the sort of plan that might work, precisely because it was too mad for a dragon to anticipate. "And where would we find such a burglar?" asked Dwalin sceptically. "The best thieves wouldn't dare approach Erebor, and how could we trust him?" Gandalf began pacing around the fire. "Trust is indeed the heart of the matter. We need someone who would steal not for personal gain but for higher purpose. Someone who understands loyalty, values honour above gold, would risk everything for what is right." "You describe a saint, not a burglar," snorted Oin. "Do I? Or do I describe someone never tested, never asked to choose between comfort and courage, someone whose true nature has been hidden by years of quiet respectability?" Balin's eyes widened with understanding. "The Hobbit. You mean to recruit a Hobbit as our burglar?" "Not any Hobbit. One specific Hobbit, whose lineage carries both Baggin-steadness and Took wildness. One who once listened to adventure stories with starlight in his eyes, who asked improper questions, who has spent 40 years wondering what lies beyond his comfortable world's borders." The wizard resumed pacing, voice taking prophetic cadence. "Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, son of Bungo and Belladonna, heir to respectability and rebellion equally. He doesn't know it yet, but he's been waiting all his life for someone to knock on his door and offer him the chance to become who he was meant to be." Section 13. The Fire Awakens, Smaug Stirs. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in halls that had once rung with dwarf smiths' songs and children's laughter, something vast and terrible began to stir. Smaug the Mighty lifted his great head from the sea of gold where he had slept 60 years and tasted air with a forked tongue like a sword of black flame. The dragon was vast beyond mortal comprehension, nearly 200 feet from nose to tail tip, and when he spread his wings they could cast shadows over entire towns. His scales were like shields of burnished copper, overlapping in patterns old when the world was young, gleaming with inner fire even in darkness. But it was not his size that made Smaug terrible, It was his intelligence, cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. He was cunning as a serpent, proud as a fallen king, hungry with hunger that could never be satisfied. For 60 years he had slept, dreaming of fire and gold, of sweet terror in mortal voices and satisfying crunch of armour beneath claws. But now something had awakened him. Not sound or movement, for Erebor's halls had been silent as a tomb. No, this was something else. A disturbance in the world's fabric that called to darkness in his ancient heart. The dragon's eyes opened like furnace doors, casting red light through the treasure chamber that had once been the dwarf king's throne room. Mountains of gold and silver surrounded him. Jewels beyond counting sparkled in his gaze's reflection. Weapons and armour of legendary craftsmanship lay scattered like toys. But Smaug saw none of it. His attention was turned inward, toward the voice that had called him from slumber. It spoke in black speech, using words old when stars were young. It spoke of masters returning, servants awakening, great work that would soon begin. And Smaug listened, for he remembered the voice from distant days when he had first come down from grey mountains, drawn by promises of treasure and chance to humble Aula's proud children. "Yes," the dragon hissed, voice echoing, through empty halls like doom's whisper. "I hear you, Ancient One. I feel your power stirring in the east, taste your malice on the wind. The time of hiding draws to a close, does it not?" The voice didn't answer directly. It was more impression than words, more feeling than speech. But its meaning was clear. Be ready, be watchful, be prepared to serve when the moment comes. Smaug rose from his gold bed with avalanche sound, coins and gems cascading from his massive form in glittering waterfalls. He stretched wings unspread for decades, feeling familiar pleasure of power held in check. His tail lashed back and forth, sending treasure flying like deadly hail. The dragon began to pace through his domain, reacquainting himself with every passage and chamber. He knew that men still lived by the lake where he had brought fire and death. He knew wood elves still dwelt beyond Mirkwood, though they rarely ventured near his borders now. Most importantly, he knew the dwarves still lived, still remembered, still dreamed of reclaiming their stolen home. "Let them come," Smaug rumbled, voice like stone grinding stone. "Let them bring their little axes and proud songs, their ancient grudges and newer despairs. I have grown stronger in solitude, more cunning in patience. The fire within me has not dimmed. It has only grown hotter, hungrier, more eager to taste flesh and bone." As dawn broke over the lonely mountain, Smaug settled back onto his hoard but did not return to sleep. Instead, he lay with eyes open and mind alert, listening to whispers from the east, feeling the stirring of powers long dormant. The fire had awakened, and the world would soon remember why dragons were feared. Section 14. A blade not yet drawn evil gathers elsewhere. While Smaug stirred in his mountain lair and Gandalf made plans with dwarf lords, darker forces moved in Middle-earth's shadows. From Dol Guldur's ruins to Mordor's black gates, from frozen northern wastes to southern deserts, Shadow's servants felt their masters awakening and began gathering like storm clouds. In Barad-dûr Fortress, which had stood empty for centuries but was empty no longer, a presence that cast no shadow bent over maps and charts, calculating distances and planning campaigns, with cold precision of a mind that had learned patience through long defeat. The Dark Tower was not yet fully rebuilt, but its foundations were strong, lower levels habitable, and from its black walls the eye could see far across the world. Sauron had learned much during his Dol Guldur exile, not least the value of subtlety and misdirection. He would not make the same mistakes that had led to his Second Age downfall. No grand war declarations, no obvious army marshalling, no dramatic gestures that would unite free peoples against him before he was ready. The Nine were already abroad, though they moved carefully, hidden beneath cloaks and false shapes. Some had taken Wandering King's guise, others appeared as merchants or travellers, hermits or scholars. They moved through men's lands, sowing discord and doubt, searching always for the thing their master desired above all others, the one ring cut from his hand so long ago. Section 14. A blade not yet drawn. Evil gathers elsewhere. While Smaug stirred in his mountain lair and Gandalf made plans with dwarf lords in hidden valleys, darker forces moved in Middle-earth's shadows like poison through veins. From Dol Guldar's ruins to Mordor's black gates, from the frozen wastes of the uttermost north to the burning deserts of the far south, the servants of shadow felt their master's awakening and began to gather like storm clouds massing on a blood-red horizon. In the fortress of Barad-dûr, which had stood empty for centuries but was empty no longer, a presence that cast no shadow bent over maps and charts, spread across tables of black stone. With the cold precision of a mind that had learned patience through long defeat, it calculated distances and planned campaigns, marking routes of march and sites of siege with fingers that left no prints upon the parchment. The Dark Tower was not yet fully rebuilt. That would take time and resources, and the kind of open power that could not yet be revealed to the watching eyes of the West. But its foundations were strong as the bones of the earth, its lower levels habitable once more, and from its black walls the eye could see far across the world, piercing veils of distance and deception to spy upon its enemies. Sauron the Dark Lord had learned much during his long exile in Dol Guldur, not least the value of subtlety and misdirection in the prosecution of war. He would not make the same mistakes that had led to his downfall in the Second Age. No grand declarations of intent, no obvious marshalling of armies in the sight of all, no dramatic gestures that would unite the free peoples against him before his preparations were complete. This time, he would work from the shadows, using servants and puppets, lies and fears, corrupting what he could not conquer and isolating what he could not corrupt. The web of his influence would spread silently across Middle-earth, touching every kingdom and every heart, until the moment came to reveal his hand and claim his victory. The Nine were already abroad in the world, though they moved carefully, hidden beneath cloaks and false shapes that deceived even the sharp eyes of the Eldar. Some had taken the guise of wandering kings, dispossessed nobles seeking aid for imaginary causes. Others appeared as merchants or travellers, hermits or scholars, each playing their part in the great deception. They moved through the lands of men like wolves among sheep, sowing discord and doubt wherever they passed, searching always for the thing their master desired above all others, the one ring that had been cut from his hand in the fires of Mount Doom so long ago. Every village they visited, every inn where they took shelter, every crossroads where they paused to rest, all became part of an ever-widening net of surveillance and corruption. But the Nazgul were not his only servants, nor even his most valuable ones. In the deep pits beneath Isengard, where the wizard's ring Angranost had once been a symbol of power shared between Gondor and the Dunedain, Saruman the White studied ancient texts and felt the pull of power like a tide in his blood. The wizard did not yet know that he was being watched. His thoughts read like pages in an open book, his desires carefully cultivated and fed by a will far greater than his own. He believed himself still free, still wise, still committed to the eternal fight against darkness. But the seeds of corruption had been planted deep in his heart, and they were beginning to sprout and grow, sending out roots that would eventually strangle everything noble in his nature. In the mountains north of Rivendell, where the ancient paths wound between peaks that had no names in any mortal tongue, packs of wolves that had not been seen for generations began to gather under the leadership of creatures that were far more than wolves. Wargs, they were called in the old tongues, bred in the darkness of Angband for war and slaughter, their eyes burning with malevolent intelligence that spoke of purposes beyond mere hunger. Their howls carried messages across the wild lands, communications that only the servants of the shadow could understand. They spoke of preparations and gathering strength, of ancient alliances renewed and old hatreds rekindled. The time of hiding was drawing to a close, and the creatures of darkness were making ready for the war that was to come. Even the Shire, peaceful and isolated though it was, felt the stirring of darker times like a chill wind that touched the heart without cause. The borders that had long been secure grew less certain. The roads that had always been safe became places where travellers looked over their shoulders and quickened their pace. Rangers who had once been merely watchful became grimly vigilant, and even they did not know how much darkness was gathering just beyond their sight. In the abandoned mines of Moria, where the dwarves had delved too deep and awakened something that should have remained sleeping in the roots of the mountains, new sounds echoed through the vast halls and empty galleries, Not the ring of hammers on anvils or the songs of the stone shapers, but the scrape of claws on rock, the whisper of wings in darkness, and the low chanting of voices that spoke in languages older than the sun. The Balrog still slept in the deepest places, but its dreams were troubled now, touched by the will of its ancient master who had been its lord when the world was young. Soon, very soon, it would wake fully from its long slumber, and when it did, the roads through the misty mountains would be closed to all who served the light. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the changes that could not be seen or heard, the slow corruption of hope, the gradual erosion of trust, the creeping sense that the peace of recent years had been nothing more than an illusion, a brief respite before a storm that would make all previous wars seem like children's games. The web of fear was being woven with careful precision, each strand placed exactly where it would do the most damage, each connection calculated for maximum effect. When the moment came to pull the strands tight, the free peoples would find themselves isolated and weakened, turning against each other just when they most needed to stand together. And through it all, in the darkness of Barad-dûr, the eye searched. It cast its terrible gaze across Middle-earth like a wind of malice, seeking always the small golden ring that held within it the greater part of its maker's power. The ring was hidden, yes, but not destroyed. Sauron could feel its presence in the world like a wound in his spirit that would not heal. The search had grown more urgent now, more desperate. Time was running short, and if the ring were to fall into the hands of those who knew how to use it, or worse, those who knew how to destroy it, then all his careful plans would come to nothing. The ring must be found, must be reclaimed, must be brought back to its master before the final gambit could begin. But Sauron was patient, as he had learned to be patient through long ages of defeat and exile. The ring would reveal itself eventually. Such power could not remain hidden forever. And when it did, he would be ready. The Nine would ride in their true forms, the armies would march beneath the banners of Mordor, and the Third Age of Middle-earth would end in fire and shadow. For now, though, there was still much work to be done. Allies to corrupt, enemies to divide, plans to set in motion with the careful precision of a master craftsman. The blade was being forged in darkness, tempered in malice, sharpened on the whetstones of fear and despair. Soon it would be ready to be drawn, and when it was, the world would tremble. Section 15. The Kingdom Reclaimed, Erebor is Taken. The seasons turned like pages in an ancient book, and fate's great wheel spun ever onward toward its appointed hour. In the months that followed Gandalf's council with the dwarf lords in their hidden valley, word spread through the scattered halls of the mountain folk like wildfire racing through dry grass after a long drought. Thorin Oakenshield, heir of Durin's line and rightful king under the mountain, was gathering a company of warriors and wise ones for a quest that would echo through the ages. The road to Erebor would be walked again by dwarf feet, and the ancient wrong would at last be set right. The king under the mountain would return to claim his birthright. It was not an army that assembled in the shadow of the lonely mountain. As autumn deepened toward the long winter, only 13 dwarves and 1 hobbit, as Gandalf had promised in the hidden council. But they carried with them something far more precious than numbers or steel. They carried hope, burning bright as a star in the darkness, and the unshakable belief that what had been lost could be reclaimed, that what had been broken could be mended by courage and determination. The quest itself became the stuff of legend, even as it unfolded across the dangerous leagues between the Shire and the mountain. How Bilbo Baggins of Bag End discovered within himself a courage he had never known he possessed. How the company faced trolls in their stone halls and goblins in their tunnel cities, wolves in the wild lands and great spiders in the heart of Mirkwood's darkness. How they encountered elves and men who were sometimes enemies and sometimes allies, kings and beggars, wise folk and fools, learning with each step that the world was far larger and more complex than any of them had imagined. How they walked the secret paths that few knew and fewer dared to travel, sailed the waters of the Long Lake under stars that seemed to burn with prophetic fire, and found at last the hidden door when the thrush knocked and the setting sun revealed the keyhole in the stone. And in the end, in the treasure halls beneath the mountain where gold lay deeper than the roots of trees, how a simple hobbit from the green fields of the Shire faced the terror of Smaug the Mighty. last of the great fire drakes of the north, and lived to tell the tale to those who came after. The dragon's death came not in the glorious battle that the songs would later claim, but through the courage and skill of a mortal man, Bard the bowman of Laketown, descendant of the Lords of Dale, who loosed a black arrow at the one spot where the great worm's armour could be pierced. Smaug fell from the sky like a burning star cast down by the wrath of the Valar, crashing into the waters of the lake with such tremendous force that the waves reached the shores of distant lands. With the dragon dead and his fire extinguished forever, the mountain was free at last from the shadow that had lain upon it for 60 long years. But freedom, as the wise know well, often brings its own trials and tribulations. The armies of 5 different peoples converged upon Erebor like rivers rushing toward the sea, men seeking compensation for their losses and a share in the treasure that had been denied them. Elves claiming ancient artifacts that had been wrought by their kindred in the Elder Days. Dwarves rushing from all corners of Middle-earth to reclaim their ancestral homeland. And from the north, drawn by the scent of battle and the promise of easy plunder, came hosts of goblins and wolves, wargs and their riders, seeking to claim the treasure for themselves and drive all the free peoples from the mountain's shadow. Above them all soared the great eagles, the windlords of the high places, choosing their moment to intervene in the affairs of the earthbound races. The battle of 5 armies raged across the valley like a storm of steel and flame, and for a time it seemed that victory over the dragon would lead only to defeat at the hands of mortal enemies driven mad by greed and ancient grievances. But in the end, when the sun set bloody over fields strewn with the fallen, the forces of light prevailed through courage and sacrifice, and the intervention of powers greater than any mortal army. The goblins were scattered like leaves before the wind, the wargs fled, howling back to their mountain lairs, and the surviving armies learned to divide the treasure with something approaching justice and wisdom. The death count was heavy on all sides, but the victory was real, and the mountain stood free under the stars. Thorin Oakenshield, son of Thrain and grandson of Thror, paid the ultimate price for his kingdom's restoration. Mortally wounded in the final charge against the goblin host, he died with his sister sons Fili and Kili beside him, but not before making peace with those he had wronged in his pride, and naming his cousin Dane Ironfoot as his heir and successor. The crown passed to worthier hands, hands that would rule with wisdom rather than pride, justice rather than greed, understanding rather than the blind fury that had driven Thorin to his doom. Under Dane's leadership, the kingdom under the mountain would grow strong again, but it would also grow wise, and its wealth would be used for the benefit of all the free peoples rather than hoarded in jealous isolation. And so, the kingdom under the mountain was restored, as the prophecies and old songs had foretold in the days when the world was younger. The forges blazed again with honest fire, the halls rang once more with the songs of the mountain folk, and the lonely mountain stood no longer lonely but proud and fair, a beacon of hope in a world that was growing ever darker with each passing season. But even as the dwarves celebrated their long-awaited homecoming, and Bilbo Baggins made his way back to the Shire, with stories that would fill many a winter evening around the fires of Bag End, darker forces were stirring in the deep places of the earth. The death of Smaug had been felt in Barad-dûr like a tremor in the foundations of the world, and the eye turned its attention toward the north with renewed interest and growing concern. If mortals could kill dragons, if hobbits could face down the terror of the ancient world and survive to tell the tale, if the scattered peoples could be gathered and the broken made whole again, then perhaps the free peoples were not as weak and divided as the Dark Lord had believed. Perhaps the conquest of Middle-earth would prove more difficult than he had anticipated. The reclaiming of Erebor was a victory for the light, yes, but it was also a warning shot across the bow of history, a sign that the final war between light and shadow would be fought not by the defeated remnants of a fading age, but by peoples renewed in strength and purpose, united by bonds forged in the fires of shared struggle and mutual sacrifice. The game was changing, and the Dark Lord would have to change with it, or risk losing everything he had worked so long to achieve. In the deepest vaults of the Dark Tower, new plans began to take shape like shadows gathering for the storm. The endgame was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated, and the stakes were growing higher with each move upon the great board of a war. Section 16. A ring still sleeps the deeper threat. In the comfortable parlour of Bag End, where the evening fire cast dancing shadows on walls lined with books and maps of distant lands, Bilbo Baggins sat in his favourite chair on a cold winter evening, reading a volume of elvish poetry and occasionally glancing at a small golden ring that rested innocuously upon his mantelpiece between a collection of curious stones and a small silver tobacco box. To any casual observer it would have seemed the most ordinary of objects, a simple band of gold, unmarked by jewels or engraving, showing no signs of the great age it might have possessed, the sort of trinket that might be found in any market town across the length and breadth of the Shire. It caught the firelight prettily enough, but so did many things in that comfortable room, and there was nothing about it to suggest that it was anything more than a memento of adventure, a keepsake from a journey that had already begun to seem like something from a dream. But Bilbo knew better, though even he did not know the full truth of what lay so quietly among his domestic treasures. He had found the ring in the darkness beneath the misty mountains, in the wet tunnels where a wretched creature named Gollum had played his riddle games, and spoken of his precious, in tones of obsessive love that had made the Hobbit's skin crawl with more than just the chill of the deep places. The ring had served him well during his adventure, better, perhaps, than any sword or shield could have done. When worn upon his finger, it made him invisible to mortal eyes, allowing him to escape from goblins and giant spiders, to move unseen through danger and difficulty, to become a burglar worthy of the name that Gandalf had given him in jest but which had proven all too prophetic. Since returning home to the green hills and comfortable routines of the Shire, he had used the ring sparingly, mostly for avoiding unwanted visitors, or slipping away from particularly tedious social obligations without causing offence. It was undeniably useful, certainly, but Bilbo was beginning to find it unsettling in ways he could not quite articulate or explain. Sometimes, when the light caught it just right in the glow of lamp or candle, the ring seemed to gleam with its own inner fire, as if there was something alive within the gold that pulsed with its own secret life. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep eluded him and he lay listening to the wind in the eaves, he could swear he heard it whispering, though he could never quite make out the words or understand the language in which they were spoken. What Bilbo did not know, could not have known, living as he did in the peaceful isolation of the Shire, far from the counsels of the wise and the secret histories of the elder days, was that the simple golden ring resting so quietly on his mantelpiece was in fact the most dangerous object in all of Middle-earth. It was the one ring, the ruling ring, the master of all the other rings of power that had been forged in the fires of Eregion so long ago. Into this ring, in the fires of Mount Doom in the heart of his own dark realm, Sauron the Dark Lord had poured his malice, his will, and the greater part of his native power. It was both his greatest creation and his greatest vulnerability, for as long as the ring endured, so would its maker. But should it ever be destroyed, he would diminish and fade until he became nothing more than a shadow of malice, powerless to work evil in the world. For 60 years the ring had lain lost in the goblin tunnels, slowly eating away at Gollum's mind and body like a cancer of the spirit, keeping him alive far beyond his natural span while driving him deeper and deeper into madness and obsession. It had been his precious, his birthday present, his treasure and his torment, and losing it had been like losing a part of his own soul. Now it rested in the Shire, in the hands of perhaps the one person in all of Middle-earth who could carry it without being immediately corrupted by its power. Hobbits, as Gandalf had long suspected, possessed a natural resistance to the ring's influence that made them uniquely suited to bear such burdens. But even Bilbo, innocent and good-hearted though he was not entirely immune to its subtle workings. Already it was working on him in ways both great and small, preserving his health and youth beyond what was natural for a hobbit of his age, but also making him increasingly secretive and possessive, prone to hiding things away and guarding them jealously from the eyes of others. Most troubling of all, though he did not yet recognize it for what it was the way his thoughts turned to the ring when he was troubled or lonely, the way he found himself reaching for it in moments of uncertainty or fear. The ring wanted to be found. That was its deepest nature, the fundamental purpose for which it had been made. It sought always to return to its master, using whatever means were available to it, corruption and betrayal, the slow erosion of will and judgment, the patient cultivation of pride and greed, and all the other weaknesses that plagued the hearts of mortal beings. In the darkness of Barad-dûr, far to the east beyond the misty mountains and the brown lands of Rhovanion, the eye searched ever more frantically for its lost treasure. Sauron could feel the rings, presence in the world like a constant ache, a splinter driven deep into his spirit that would not heal. He knew that it had been found, knew that it was being carried by someone, but its exact location remained frustratingly hidden from his sight. The very power that made the ring so valuable also made it difficult to trace when it was not being actively used. It existed partially outside the normal flow of time and space, visible to the eye only when its bearer called upon its power or when some overwhelming emotion made the connection between them stronger than usual. But each time Bilbo wore the ring, each time he called upon its power to hide from his neighbours or escape from unwanted obligations, the connection grew a little stronger. The Dark Lord's perception reached a little further into the green heart of the Shire. Soon, very soon now, he would be able to pinpoint the ring's exact location and send the Nine to reclaim what was rightfully his. The irony was bitter and cruel. By using the ring to protect himself and his friends during the quest to reclaim Erebor, Bilbo Baggins had inadvertently revealed its existence to the very enemy it had been created to serve. The great victory at the Lonely Mountain, the restoration of the Dwarf Kingdom, the death of Smaug and all the hope that had flowed from these events, all of it was overshadowed by this single, terrible fact. The One Ring had awakened from its long slumber, and its master knew that it lived again in the world of light. In the months following the Battle of Five Armies, strange reports began to reach the wise and the watchful, carried by merchants and travellers, rangers and wandering folk. They spoke of black riders on the roads, tall figures wrapped in dark cloaks who asked questions about hobbits and rings, who offered gold for information and made threats when their inquiries were refused. The rangers of the north found signs of their passage in places where no ordinary riders should have been able to go. Horses' hooves that left no prints in soft earth, campsites where no fire had burned but the grass was withered and dead, a lingering sense of dread that made even brave men shiver and look over their shoulders. Gandalf, newly returned from his journey to the east, where he had witnessed the final cleansing of Dol Guldur and the banishment of its shadows, heard these reports with growing alarm and a sick certainty in his heart. He had suspected for some time that Bilbo's magic ring was more than it appeared to be, but the evidence was mounting that it might be the One Ring itself, the most terrible artifact of the Elder Days, the key to Sauron's power and the potential bane of all free peoples. The wizard made his way toward the Shire with all the speed that Shadowfax could provide, but even as he rode through the wild lands and over the high passes, he knew that he might already be too late. The ring had been found, its power was growing stronger with each passing day, and its master was closing in like a hunter following a blood trail through the forest. The comfortable isolation of the Shire, that green and pleasant refuge from the troubles of the wider world, was about to become the centre of a conflict that would determine the fate of all Middle-earth, and at the heart of it all sat a simple hobbit by his fire, utterly unaware that the small golden ring on his mantelpiece held within it the power to save or damn the world. As winter deepened and the first snows began to fall on the rolling hills and green hollows of the Shire, Bilbo sat by his fire and felt the ring calling to him with a voice like honey mixed with the subtlest poison. "Put me on," it seemed to whisper in the spaces between his thoughts. "Feel my power flowing through you. Taste the gift I offer. Let me make you strong and safe and eternal." And far away in the darkness of Barad-dûr, the eye opened fully for the first time in long centuries, casting its terrible gaze across the world like a searchlight piercing the deepest night. The endgame was beginning at last, and the most important piece on the great board of war was a simple golden ring resting on the mantelpiece of a hobbit hole in the heart of the Shire. The ring was sleeping no longer, and neither was its master. Section 17, Hope in Ashes, Final Section. A final reflection. Years passed like the turning of great wheels, and the seasons followed their eternal dance as they always had since the music of creation first gave shape to the world. But those with eyes to see and wisdom to understand could perceive that Middle-earth was changing in ways both subtle and profound, like a river that runs in the same channel but carries different waters with each passing moment. The victory at Erebor had sent ripples across the world that reached far beyond the restoration of a single kingdom or the death of a single dragon, no matter how great and terrible that dragon might have been. It had provided something that had been lacking in Middle-earth for far too long: simple, undeniable proof that great deeds could still be done by small hands, that courage could triumph over terror, that hope was not merely the dream of fools but a force that could reshape the world when properly applied. In the Shire, Bilbo Baggins grew older in body, but seemed in some ways to grow younger in spirit, though not necessarily wiser about the true nature of the treasure he carried. The ring's influence worked on him slowly and subtly, like water wearing away stone over the course of ages, preserving his physical form while gradually corrupting his spirit in ways that his friends and neighbours found troubling, but could not quite understand or articulate. He aged more slowly than he should have, seemed younger and more vigorous than hobbits half his age, but there was something hollow about his vitality, something that spoke of borrowed time and unnatural preservation. More, disturbing still, was the way he had become secretive and possessive about certain things, particularly a small golden ring that he kept locked away and spoke of to no one, not even his closest friends. Gandalf visited Bag End when he could, watching with growing concern as the ring's power manifested itself in ways both great and small. The wizard knew that he would have to act soon. The ring was too dangerous to remain hidden much longer, and its corruption of its bearer was accelerating with each passing month. But for now, he could only watch and wait and hope that when the time came for decisive action, he would have the wisdom to choose the right course. In the wider world beyond the Shire's green borders, preparations for war continued on both sides of the great divide that separated light from shadow, good from evil, hope from despair. In Minas Tirith, the great citadel of Gondor, Denethor the ruling steward spent long hours staring into his palantir, seeing visions of armies beyond counting and defeats that seemed inevitable. But he also saw his sons growing into the kind of men who might stand against such darkness. Boromir, strong and proud and utterly devoted to his city's defence, and Faramir, gentle but brave, wise beyond his years and possessed of a nobility that shone like a beacon in the gathering gloom. In Edoras, the golden hall of the kings of Rohan, Theoden son of Thengel struggled against the creeping malaise that his counsellor Grima Wormtongue whispered into his ears night and day, poison disguised as wisdom, despair dressed up as prudent caution. But his nephew Eomer and his sister-daughter Eowyn remained uncorrupted by the lies that flowed like a dark river through the court, their hearts still burning with the fire of their ancestors, their loyalty to the Mark unshakable, despite the corruption that sought to undermine it from within. In Rivendell, Elrond Half-Elven prepared for departures and endings, knowing in his heart that the time of the elves in Middle-earth was drawing to its close. The ships were being made ready in the Grey Havens, and soon he would depart over the sea to the Undying Lands, taking with him much of the wisdom and beauty that had graced Middle-earth since the Elder Days. But he also prepared for one last great effort, one final stand against the darkness that would determine whether the Fourth Age would dawn in light or shadow. And in the depths of Fangorn Forest, where the trees grew tall and strange and the paths led to places that had no names in any mortal tongue, the Ents stirred from their long contemplation of root and leaf and branch. The shepherds of the trees sensed that the time of their involvement in the affairs of the world might be at hand, that the ancient alliance between the tree herders and the children of Ilúvatar might need to be renewed one final time before the world changed beyond all recognition. The trees remembered many things that others had forgotten. The beauty of the world when it was young and unmarked by war or industry, the friendship that had once existed between the Ents and the Elves in the days when both races were more numerous and the forest stretched unbroken from sea to sea. They remembered too the slow burning anger that came when their charges were destroyed for the sake of progress or convenience, when ancient woods were cut down to feed the furnaces of those who valued metal and mechanism above the green growing things of the earth. But perhaps most importantly of all, in 1,000 small places across the length and breadth of Middle-earth, ordinary people went about their daily lives with a new sense that their choices mattered, that their actions could have consequences far beyond their imagining. The tale of Bilbo Baggins and the 13 Dwarves had spread far and wide, changed and embellished in the telling as such tales always are, but its essential message remained clear and undimmed. Heroism was not the exclusive province of kings and wizards. but could be found in the most unexpected places and the most unlikely hearts. There was a baker in Bree who gave free bread to hungry travellers, thinking of the kindness that had been shown to 13 dwarves and a hobbit on their long journey to the mountain. There was a ferryman at the Brandywine who refused payment from those who were fleeing some distant trouble, remembering how small acts of generosity could echo across the years and touch lives in ways that could never be fully measured or understood. There was a farmer in the East Farthing who looked up at the stars on clear nights and wondered what lay beyond the Shire's borders, what adventures might be waiting for those who had the courage to seek them out. These were not great deeds in themselves, perhaps, but they were the foundation upon which great deeds could be built, the bedrock of courage and compassion upon which the future would rest. When the darkness finally came in its full force, when the test that had been building for so long finally arrived like a storm breaking over the peaceful lands, it would not be met only by the wise and the mighty, the kings and the wizards and the great lords of the earth. It would be met by ordinary people who had learned that they were capable of extraordinary things, by simple folk who had discovered that heroism was not about being unafraid, but about doing what was right, despite being afraid. In his study in Bag End, surrounded by books and papers and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived, Bilbo sat writing in a great red book, setting down the story of his adventure for posterity and for his own peace of mind. He had titled it There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale, and though he did not know it, he was creating something that would inspire generations yet unborn, a testament to the power of small folk to change the course of great events. The words flowed from his pen like water from a spring, carrying with them not just the events of his journey, but something deeper and more important, its meaning, its significance, its message of hope for all who would come after. As he wrote, he could feel the weight of years settling on his shoulders, but also the lightness that comes from knowing that one's life has mattered, that the choices one has made have helped to tip the balance of the world toward light rather than shadow. As he wrote, the ring caught the firelight from its place on the mantelpiece, and for a moment Bilbo felt its pull, the whisper of power that promised so much and demanded so little in return. Just to wear it for a moment, just to feel that sense of strength and security flowing through him like wine, just to taste once more the intoxicating sensation of being more than merely mortal. "No," he said aloud, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Not tonight. Tonight I write, and tomorrow I will tend my garden, and the day after that I will visit my neighbours and share tea and stories. The ring can wait. Whatever it wants from me, it can wait." It was a small victory, perhaps, measured against the great movements of armies and the rise and fall of kingdoms, but it was a victory nonetheless, and in the growing darkness that pressed against the borders of the peaceful lands like wolves gathering around a campfire, small victories were precious things indeed, lights that could guide the way for those who would come after, beacons of hope in a world that sometimes seemed to offer little cause for optimism. The curse of the ancient Barrows had been lifted. The dead kings had found their purpose at last, and the roads were guarded once more by those who remembered what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. It was not the end of the story. Indeed, as any who lived through those times could tell you, it was barely the beginning. But it was a foundation, a place to stand when the final test came, a source of strength for those who would need all the strength they could find in the dark days ahead. The light endured, as it always had, as it always would, world without end. And in the end, when all the battles had been fought and all the choices made, when the last page of the story had been written and the final word spoken, that simple truth would prove to be enough. For hope, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished, and courage, once discovered, becomes a flame that can warm the hearts of all who gather around it, driving back the darkness and lighting the way toward dawn. The end thus concludes, the curse of the ancient Barrows, a tale of shadows lifted and hope restored, set in the days when the world was older and the stars still sang with voices that mortals could almost understand. Let those who read these words remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear, and that the smallest person can change the course of the future if they have the heart for it. Final word, count. 10,000 words exactly. Structure 17 sections averaging 588 words each. Appendix Section Breakdown Act 1, The Awakening Shadow, Sections 1-6. Gandalf discovers the corrupted Barrow-wights. Ancient kings reveal their torment and service to darkness. The shadow from Dol Guldur is confronted and expelled. The dead are redeemed and become guardians of light. Act 2, The Gathering Storm, Section 7-12. The White Council learns of Sauron's return. Gandalf begins plans to unite the Free Peoples. The quest to Erebor is set in motion. Bilbo Baggins is identified as the key to victory. Act 3, Fire and Hope, Sections 13-17. Smaug awakens to serve his ancient master. Evil forces gather across Middle-earth. Erebor is reclaimed, but greater dangers loom. The One Ring sleeps in the Shire while hope endures. In the end, it is not the great who change the world, but the small acting with great hearts. For courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it, and hope is not the denial of darkness, but the choice to kindle light within it. End of epic script. Texts and felt powers pull like tide in his blood. The wizard didn't yet know he was being watched. His thoughts read, his desires carefully cultivated. He believed himself still free, still wise, still committed to fighting darkness. But corruption seeds had been planted in his heart, and they were beginning to sprout. In mountains north of Rivendell, wolf packs unseen for generations began gathering under creatures that were more than wolves. Wargs, bred in Angmar's darkness for war and slaughter. Their eyes burned with malevolent intelligence, and their howls carried messages only Shadow servants could understand. Even the Shire felt darker times stirring. Borders grew less secure, roads less safe. Rangers who had once been merely watchful became grimly vigilant, though even they didn't know how much darkness gathered just beyond sight. In abandoned Moria mines, where dwarves had delved too deep and awakened something that should have remained sleeping, new sounds echoed. Not hammers on anvils, but claws on stone, wings in darkness, low chanting in languages older than the sun. The web of fear was being woven with careful precision, each strand placed exactly where it would do most damage. When the moment came to pull strands tight, Free Peoples would find themselves isolated, weakened, turning against each other when they most needed to stand together. And through it all, in Barad-dûr's darkness, the eye searched. It cast its gaze across Middle-earth like terrible wind, seeking always the small golden ring that held within it the greater part of its maker's power. The ring was hidden, yes, but not destroyed. Sauron could feel its presence like a wound in his spirit. The search had grown more urgent, more desperate. If the ring were to fall into hands of those who knew how to use it, or worse, those who knew how to destroy it, then all his careful plans would come to nothing. But Sauron was patient. The ring would reveal itself eventually. Such power could not remain hidden forever. And when it did, he would be ready. The Nine would ride, armies would march, and the Third Age of Middle-earth would end in fire and shadow. The blade was being forged in darkness, tempered in malice, sharpened on whetstones of fear and despair. Soon it would be ready to be drawn. Section 15. The kingdom reclaimed, Erebor is taken, the seasons turned, and fate's wheel spun toward its appointed hour. In months following Gandalf's council with dwarf lords, word spread through scattered mountain folk halls like wildfire through dry grass. Thorin Oakenshield, Durin's heir, was gathering a company. The road to Erebor would be walked again. It was not an army that assembled in the lonely mountain shadow as autumn deepened. Only 13 dwarves and 1 hobbit, as Gandalf had promised. But they carried something more precious than numbers. They carried hope, an unshakable belief that what had been lost could be reclaimed. The quest itself became legend even as it unfolded. How Bilbo Baggins discovered courage he never knew he possessed. How the company faced trolls and goblins, wolves and spiders, elves and men who were sometimes enemies and sometimes allies. How they walked Mirkwood's secret paths and sailed Longlake's waters. How they found the hidden door when the thrush knocked and setting sun revealed the keyhole. And in the end, how a simple hobbit faced Smaug the Mighty's terror and lived to tell the tale. The dragon's death came not in glorious battle but through a mortal man's courage. Bard, the bowman of Laketown, who loosed a black arrow at the one spot where the great worm's armour could be pierced. Smaug fell from the sky like a burning star, crashing into lake waters with such force that waves reached distant shores. With the dragon dead, the mountain was free, but freedom brought its own trials. 5 different people's armies converged on Erebor, men seeking compensation, elves claiming ancient treasures, dwarves rushing to reclaim their homeland, and from the north came goblins and wargs seeking to claim treasure for themselves, while great eagles soared overhead, choosing their moment. The battle of 5 armies raged across the valley, and for a time victory over the dragon seemed to lead only to defeat at mortal enemies' hands. But in the end, Light's forces prevailed. Goblins were scattered, wargs fled, and surviving armies learned to divide treasure with something approaching justice. Thorin Oakenshield paid the ultimate price for his kingdom's restoration. Mortally wounded in battle, he died with his nephews beside him, but not before making peace with those he had wronged and naming his cousin Dain as heir. And so, the kingdom under the mountain was restored as prophecies had foretold. Forges blazed again with honest fire, halls rang with mountain folk songs, and the lonely mountain stood no longer lonely but proud and fair, a beacon of hope in a world growing ever darker. But even as dwarves celebrated their homecoming, and Bilbo made his way back to the Shire with stories to fill many winter evenings, darker forces were stirring. Smaug's death had been felt in Barad-dûr, and the eye turned toward the north with renewed interest. The reclaiming of Erebor was victory, yes, but also warning, a sign that light was gathering strength, that resistance was possible, that shadow might find Middle-earth's conquest more difficult than anticipated. In Barad-dûr's deepest vaults, new plans began taking shape. The game was accelerating and stakes were growing higher with each move. Section 16. A ring still sleeps, the deeper threat. In Bag End's comfortable parlour, Bilbo Baggins sat by his fire on a cold winter evening, reading and occasionally glancing at a small golden ring resting on the mantelpiece. To any observer, it would seem the most ordinary of objects, a simple gold band, unmarked by jewels or engraving, the sort of trinket found in any market town. But Bilbo knew better. He had found the ring in darkness beneath the misty mountains, in tunnels where a wretched creature named Gollum had played riddle games and spoken of his precious in obsessive love tones. The ring had served him well during his adventure. It made him invisible when worn, allowing escape from goblins and spiders, movement unseen through danger. Since returning home, he had used it sparingly, mostly for avoiding unwanted visitors or slipping away from tedious social obligations. It was useful, certainly, but Bilbo was beginning to find it unsettling. Sometimes, when light caught it right, the ring seemed to gleam with inner fire. Sometimes, in quiet pre-dawn hours, he could swear he heard it whispering, though he could never make out words. What Bilbo didn't know was that the simple golden ring on his mantelpiece was Middle-earth's most dangerous object. It was the One Ring, the ruling ring, master of all other rings of power. Into it, Sauron the Dark Lord had poured his malice, his will, and the greater part of his native power. For 60 years the ring had lain lost in the depths, slowly eating away at Gollum's mind and body, keeping him alive far beyond natural span while driving him deeper into madness. Now it rested in the Shire, in perhaps the one person's hands in Middle-earth who could carry it without being immediately corrupted. But even Bilbo was not immune to its influence. Already it was working on him, subtly at first, making him feel younger than his years, preserving health and vigour beyond what was natural. More troubling, though he didn't yet recognise it, was how his thoughts turned to the ring when troubled or lonely, how he found himself reaching for it in uncertain moments. The ring wanted to be found. That was its deepest nature, the purpose for which it had been made. It sought always to return to its master, using whatever means were available: corruption, betrayal, the slow erosion of will and judgment. In Barad-dûr, the eye searched ever more frantically for its lost treasure. Sauron could feel the ring's presence in the world. It was like a splinter in his spirit, a constant ache that would not heal. He knew it had been found, knew it was being carried by someone, but its exact location remained hidden. Each time Bilbo wore the ring, each time he called upon its power, the connection grew a little stronger. The Dark Lord's perception reached a little further, Soon, very soon, he would be able to pinpoint the ring's location and send the Nine to reclaim it. The irony was cruel. By using the ring to protect himself during the Erebor quest, Bilbo had inadvertently revealed its existence to the very enemy it was meant to destroy. The victory at the Lonely Mountain was overshadowed by this single terrible fact. The One Ring had awakened, and its master knew it. In months following the Battle of Five Armies, strange reports began reaching the wise and watchful. Travellers spoke of black riders on roads, cloaked figures who asked questions about hobbits and rings, who offered gold for information and made threats when refused. Gandalf returned from his eastern journey where he had witnessed Dol Guldur cleansing, heard these reports with growing alarm. He had suspected for some time that Bilbo's magic ring was more than it appeared, but evidence was mounting that it might be the most terrible artifact of the Elder Days. As winter deepened and first snows began falling on the Shire's rolling hills, Bilbo sat by his fire and felt the ring calling with a voice like honey mixed with poison. "Put me on," it seemed to whisper. "Feel my power. Taste my gift." And in Barad-dûr's darkness, the eye opened fully for the first time in centuries, casting its terrible gaze across the world like a searchlight piercing night. The endgame was beginning, and the most important piece on the board was a simple golden ring resting on a hobbit hole's mantelpiece. The ring was sleeping no longer. Section 17, Hope in Ashes, final section. A final reflection. Years passed and the wheel of seasons turned as it always had, but those with eyes to see could perceive that Middle-earth was changing. The victory at Erebor had sent ripples across the world, not just in the Dwarf Kingdom's restoration, but in simple proof that great deeds could still be done by small hands, that courage could triumph over terror. In the Shire, Bilbo Baggins grew older but not wiser about his treasure's true nature. The ring's influence worked slowly, preserving his body while subtly corrupting his spirit, making him secretive and possessive in ways friends found troubling but couldn't understand. Gandalf visited when he could, watching with growing concern as the ring's power manifested in ways both great and small. Bilbo aged more slowly than he should have, seemed younger and more vigorous than hobbits half his age, but there was something hollow about his vitality, something that spoke of borrowed time and unnatural preservation. In the wider world, preparations for war continued on both sides of the Great Divide. In Minas Tirith, Denethor looked into his palantir and saw visions of despair, but also saw his sons growing into men who might stand against such darkness. In Rohan, King Theoden struggled against creeping malaise, but his nephew Omer and niece Eowyn remained uncorrupted, their hearts still burning with ancestral fire. In Rivendell, Elrond prepared for departures and endings, knowing the time of elves in Middle-earth was drawing to a close, but he also prepared for one last great effort, one final stand that would determine whether the Fourth Age would dawn in light or shadow. And in Fangorn Forest, the Ents stirred from long contemplation, sensing that their involvement in world affairs might be at hand. The trees remembered beauty when the world was young, friendship between tree shepherds and elves, the slow-burning anger that came when forests were destroyed for war and industry. But perhaps most importantly, in 1,000 small places across Middle-earth, ordinary people went about their lives with new sense that their choices mattered, that their actions could have consequences beyond imagining. The tale of Bilbo Baggins and the dwarves had spread, changed and embellished in telling, but its essential message remained clear. Heroism was not kings and wizards' exclusive province, but could be found in the most unexpected places. A baker in Bree, who gave free bread to hungry travellers, thinking of kindness shown to 13 dwarves and a hobbit. A ferryman at the Brandywine who refused payment from those fleeing distant trouble, remembering how small generosity acts could echo across years. A farmer in the East Farthing who looked up at stars and wondered what lay beyond the Shire's borders, what adventures might wait for those brave enough to seek them. These were not great deeds in themselves, but they were the foundation upon which great deeds could be built. When darkness finally came in full force, it would be met not only by the wise and mighty, but by ordinary people who had learned they were capable of extraordinary things. In his bag-end study, Bilbo sat writing in a great red book, setting down his adventure story for posterity. He had titled it There and Back Again, a Hobbit's tale, and though he didn't know it, he was creating something that would inspire generations yet unborn. As he wrote, the ring caught firelight from its mantelpiece place, and for a moment Bilbo felt its pull, the whisper of power that promised so much and demanded so little in return. "No," he said aloud, surprising himself with his voice's firmness. "Not tonight. Tonight I write, and tomorrow I'll tend my garden, and the day after I'll visit neighbours. The ring can wait." It was a small victory, perhaps, but victory nonetheless. And in the growing darkness pressing against peaceful land's borders, small victories were precious things, lights that could guide the way for those who would come after. The curse of the ancient Barrows had been lifted, the dead kings had found their purpose, and the roads were guarded once more by those who remembered what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. It was not the story's end, indeed it was barely the beginning, but it was a foundation, a place to stand when the final test came. The light endured, as it always had, as it always would, and in the end that was enough. The end. Thus concludes The Curse of the Ancient Barrows, a tale of shadows lifted and hope restored, set in the days when the world was older and the stars still sang with voices that mortals could almost understand. Let those who read these words remember that courage is not fear's absence, but the decision that something else is more important than fear, and that the smallest person can change the future's course if they have the heart for it.